I'd like to welcome you to the 13th annual Sunday morning conversation with the authors. And as I say every year, we have grown from, I think, about 9 people to the group that you see today, so we're very happy about that. This event offers the community a greater opportunity to meet our wonderful authors every year, and it's really one of our favorite events. Certainly you'll notice that there are 2 people missing from the panel who were to be here, and I'll tell you a little story about that. Ben Rollins, who was coming from Wales, was stopped at the Amsterdam airport from boarding a plane to the United States. And he was stopped because his visa was revoked. And his visa was revoked. Can you tell I'm a little angry about this? Good, because I am. His visa was revoked because he was in Somalia, had been in Somalia working with the refugees that he had then written about, of course, a year ago in City of Thorns. So we spent 2 days on the phone with him outside the U.S. consulate in Amsterdam, and he was just unable to get here. He is so sad. If you read the morning paper, you know he was quoted extensively in the article, so in a sense, he's here in spirit. And of course, Ta-Nehisi Coates is not here, and that is because he has the flu. And it is apparently a very bad case of the flu. So he said he couldn't even board a plane. So I think I can promise you this, that you will have another opportunity. I just don't know when or what or where, but we will be working on that. So he feels terrible, not just the flu. He feels terrible about not being here. So anyway, thank you for coming. And right now I'd like to introduce Dr. Dave Collins. And he is the provost of Sinclair College, and he is our host this morning. Dave Collins and President Stephen Johnson have been most supportive in allotting time and talent and resources, including this morning, that they donate to us in using this facility, using this space, and having you all here. Sinclair is among the largest undergraduate colleges in this part of Ohio, serving tens of thousands of students annually. Dr. Coates is not only a proud graduate of Sinclair, but also holds a PhD from the University of Dayton. Dr. Collins has been a senior administrator at Sinclair for over 2 decades. I give you Dave Collins.
Thank you, Sharon. Senior administrator makes me feel old. Let's just say I've been here a while. How's that? But good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. Welcome to Sinclair Community College and to the conversation with the authors. As Sharon mentioned, I'm filling in for President Johnson, who had the opportunity and the privilege to have dinner with our esteemed authors last evening with President from UD, Eric Spina. Dr. Johnson has a family commitment this morning and sends his regards. Sinclair College is proud and thankful to be involved with the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. We hope we can always be a sponsor. As you know, Sinclair's middle name is community, and our focus is to help more students get more education faster and for less money. We are the largest undergraduate institution of higher learning in Southwest Ohio and take great pride in helping all students, especially the underserved, receive a high-quality, affordable education. Our participation in the Dayton Literary Peace Prize sets a tone and example for our students and the communities of interest that we serve. Education within the liberal arts framework truly liberates the individual. It allows one to look at the world as a whole and to celebrate the richness of the human experience. It's what our transfer universities expect of our graduates. It's what our employers expect of our graduates. It's what we expect of our graduates. Sinclair is also welcoming back several authors who have given presentations to our students in previous years, including Christopher Cerf, David Wood, Gilbert King, Margaret Wrinkle, Susan Southard, and Will Haygood. We've been friends of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize since its inception, and we are truly honored to host this event. Enjoy the discussion.
Thank you, Dave. We're following a different format. This year, you should have received an email from Linda Harrison asking you for questions, and we got quite a few. And I thank you for that, if you sent questions in. And what is going to happen, we're going to have an interactive panel. Christopher will ask some questions. We hope that the panelists on the stage will ask questions of each other as well, because you know each other a little bit. Because of last night, some of you know each other well. And I'm thinking something might have teased you last evening to want to follow up on one of those questions. I do want to mention that you should have gotten a flyer about Fly with the Doves when you checked in. And we would like to ask you to consider becoming a member of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize by joining Fly with the Doves. You can do that for $25 in increments of $25. You can give as many $25 as you want, okay? And so for every $25 that you donate, you will know that you will go to sustaining the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, but in addition, we are buying books for the school children who come to, I make them, they're teenagers, who come to the author series. And this year we had, I think, 8 different schools from throughout the area who came to hear Will Haygood talk about Tigerland, and we were able to give books to those schools. So your Fly with the Doves membership helps us sustain our organization by adding to the young people who know who we are and what we do. So consider that. There's a PayPal thing right online, or you can write a check and mail it in, whatever you want to do. While you're on our website, please sign up for the newsletter. We don't inundate your mailbox with unnecessary information. We send out things as necessary. So you will get maybe 6 a year, something like that, but you will know what's going on. You'll know the next date. Speaking of, the next date for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize is November 3rd, 2019. So it'll be the Sunday morning, November 3rd of 2019, because I know some of you were interested in that already, and you'll probably be signing up, okay? Christopher Surf, he is an author, composer, lyricist, voice actor, record and television producer. He is known for his musical contributions to Sesame Street, co-creating and co-producing the award-winning PBS Literacy Education television program, Between the Lions, and for his humorous articles and books. Chris is a member of our honorary advisory board, and I do want to say he and his wife, Catherine Vaz, are just amazing people. They have invited us to hold a fundraiser in their lovely home in New York, where it is equally amazing that Grammys and Emmys are sitting around like Easter eggs all over the house. So anyway, I give you Christopher Surf.
Oh, thank you, Sharon. I think the honor and the thrill is Catherine's in mine to keep getting invited back here. We find new excuses to be invited, whether we fill in for other judges or I get to do this panel. And it's become a huge part of our lives, and I'm really grateful to you and everybody for letting us do it. So let's get to it. We have an amazing panel, a few of whom I knew a little bit before and some not so well till now, but it's a great thrill to be on at the table with you guys. So let me give you some brief introductions. I really don't want to get too deeply in because it's going to take too much time, but I'll tell you a little bit about the awards that they've just won and the books that were involved in that. First of all, John Irving, who has... John is the winner, as you all know, of the 2018 Richard C. Holbrook Award. It's a Lifetime Achievement Award, well-deserved, of course. He was born in Exeter, New Hampshire in 1942, and has been nominated for a National Book Award 3 different times, winning in 1980 for the novel The World According to Garp. He also received a short story award, the O. Henry Award in 1981 for Interior Space. And in 2000, he won an Oscar as well for the Best Adopted Screenplay for The Cider House Rules. which got 7 Academy Award nominations altogether. And relevant to this award too, he won a Lambda Literary Award in the bisexual fiction category for the novel In One Person, and currently lives in Toronto. Next we have Hala Alian, who is the fiction winner for her debut novel, actually won first time out of vote. And that book is, of course, Salt Houses, which was longlisted for the Aspen Words Literary Prize and was named the Best Book of the Year by NPR and by Kirkus Reviews. She was born in Carbondale, Illinois in 1986 and grew up in Kuwait, Oklahoma, Texas, Maine, and Lebanon, which is not irrelevant to her book, for those of you who've read it. Next, our fiction runner-up for another amazing book, Pachinko, Min-Jin Lee. Pachinko was also a finalist for the National Book Award, a New York Times bestseller, and a top 10 books of the year for the New York Times, and on over 75 best of the year lists, which is no mean achievement. She was born in Seoul, South Korea, and immigrated with her family to Queens, New York in 1976 when she was 7. And from 2007 to 2011, she lived in Tokyo, where she researched and wrote Pachinko. Next is Michelle Kuo, nonfiction runner-up. Nonfiction runner-up for Reading with Patrick. Michelle was born and raised in Kalamazoo, and her parents are immigrants from Taiwan. For 2 years, she taught English at a school in Helena, Arkansas, in the Mississippi Delta, for students who had been expelled from other schools. And that's where she began the extraordinary relationship with Patrick that is the subject of her book. This means particularly a lot to me because I worked some in the Mississippi Delta too with our show Between the Lions. So we struck up an immediate accord over that. So that's great. Additionally on our panel, coming back from previous years, we have David Wood. David was the 2017 winner in nonfiction for What Have We Done? The Moral Injury of Our Longest War, a work based on his deep reporting in Iraq and Afghanistan and on veterans after they return. A really important book that won the Pulitzer Prize, or he's won the Pulitzer Prize, and covered war and conflict around the world for more than 35 years, though he was raised as a pacifist. So thank you, David. And finally, we have Patricia Engel. Also, welcome her back. She's a 2017 winner in fiction for The Veins of the Ocean, which was also named a New York Times Editor's Choice and a Best Book of the Year by the San Francisco Chronicle, Electric Literature, and Entropy. Born to Colombian parents and raised in New Jersey, Patricia currently lives in Miami. So that's our panel up here, but we also have in our audience in the first row several former prize winners and people who've been very associated with the Dayton Prize, who we hope will join in the conversation. And if you can't edge your way in just by yelling into a microphone, I'll put up your hand and I'll try to call on you. But sitting there is, in the front row is Gilbert King, first of all, a member of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize Honorary Advisory Board, and the 2013 nonfiction runner-up for Devil in the Grove, which also was awarded a 2013 Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction. Gilbert did an amazing job on a panel discussion last night, so I hope I can do nearly as well at least. Will Haygood is sitting next to Gilbert, who is the 2016 Dayton Prize Master of Ceremonies and currently a visiting distinguished scholar in residence at Miami University. Bob Shikosis is here, a member of the Honorary Advisory Board also, and the 2014 fiction winner for The Woman Who Lost Her Soul. Welcome, Bob. Margaret Wrinkle next. Well, actually, Susan is next, but you're next on the list. Margaret Wrinkle is the 2014 fiction runner-up for WASH. And sitting next to her on her right is Susan Southard, the 2016 nonfiction winner and the author of Nagasaki, and she was a final judge in nonfiction this year. And finally, Catherine Vaz, a member of the DLPP Honorary Advisory Board, Judge Fiction in 2008, 2009, and 2010. She had something to do with my sitting up here right now, and I'm lucky enough and proud to say that I'm married to her. So welcome, Catherine. And with that, let's get to questions. As Sharon said, we have a new format this year, which I'm going to do my best to try to moderate. We'll see how it goes. But I want people to feel very free to just talk and answer people or answer the same question I asked somebody else, because we want to make this much more a conversation than just a panel discussion. So I'm going to start with a question from the audience. We have some questions from the panelists too, and we'll kind of alternate those. So let me get these out. So our first question comes from an audience member, Margaret Weiner. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And she asked for any of you, did you intend for your book to have a peace theme or a theme related to the Dayton Prize Awards when you began writing it? Or to put it another way, did you sit down to start writing more because you had a story to tell or characters in mind? Or was it the message or theme that led you to write your book, or was the primary thing? Does anybody sitting here want to take a crack at that? Ollie, you're nodding.
Yeah,
So
I think for me, the novel began as a short story, and I was interested in writing about pre-67 Palestine and a young man living in that time, which was very much a time of kind of political upheaval and despair among the younger populations. And I very much just sort of followed the curiosity of the story and the character. And for a long time, like I was saying last night, wasn't thinking about audience, wasn't really thinking about who would read it. If I did think of audience, I thought of like my brother and my grandmother. Like it was very much like family driven. So yeah, I wouldn't say I sat down with that in mind, but I do think as I was getting closer to the end of the book, I started to think a little bit more about how I was hoping that this was humanizing a story and a narrative that often isn't in this country.
Great. Does anybody else want to take a crack at that question? Yeah, John, go ahead.
Of the 14 novels, by my count, there's only 6 or 7 which are political in nature or exhibit what my mother called a social conscience. And all I can say is it differs. In the case of The World According to Garp, I knew that the subject was sexual hatred, sexual intolerance. I knew that was integral to the story. The Cider House Rules never began as an abortion novel. It began as a story about an unadoptable orphan who develops a father-son relationship with the orphanage physician, who himself is childless. It was in the research at Yale Medical Historical Library that I discovered what went on at those orphanages, especially in New England in the 1930s and 40s. It was an accident. I was looking at photographs of orphans, nurses, doctors. I was aware over time how the nurses and doctors got older. And all of a sudden, I realized 8, 10, 12 years later that for the most part, no one had adopted the children. The infants changed, but the 4-year-old became a 10-year-old, became a 12-year-old. No one took them. And I realized that the decision to perform or not to perform an abortion was integral to the life of an orphanage physician, and this was corroborated with old doctors I talked to. If anybody knew what happened to those kids who were left behind, those doctors did. If any doctor were willing to risk his or her practice to perform that then illegal procedure, that doctor would. So it's not always the same.
Right. John, I'm just curious, did you get to know those doctors and nurses well in the course of your research, or was it more or less reading about them?
Most of them were memoirs. Most of them were, most of the people I wanted to talk to were dead. But the few I did get to talk to were illuminating, but most of this was memoirs. The other interesting thing was I never read a memoir, an account of a kid in an orphanage who was mistreated in the orphanage. At the age of 15, when no one had adopted them and they became wards of the state, virtual indentured servants as children somewhere, oh boy, were they abused. But at the orphanage, much to my surprise, I was expecting something Dickensian. At the orphanage, they were treated pretty well. The stories of their adopted lives, or especially of their lives beginning at age 15 as wards of the state, were never pretty.
Great, Michelle, I'd love to ask you that same question that Margaret Wayner asked too, about what led you to your book. It's nonfiction, of course, so you obviously had a theme in mind to some degree, but was it the story that you wanted to write about yourself more, or what? I'm curious what led you to write the book.
So I'm so glad for that question, because I think when we think about peace, we often forget to think about inequality and poverty and how those create worlds of violence. And that was what my book was about, which is about what it is that we owe each other in a world of incredible economic and racial inequality. So my story began not thinking at all about these issues of crime and violence. I was a teacher, and the student who was so smart and loved reading, was really introspective, stayed to himself. He was 15, and he was flourishing in my class in a place that was like one of the poorest counties in America. Place where 1 out of 3 kids are hungry in the wealthiest country in the world. And then the story changes because I leave this place. It's too hard to live there. I go on to law school, and I find out 3 years later that he has gotten into a fight and killed someone. What do? I feel like I've left him behind, that I've chosen myself over a community that needs teachers. Half the teachers at my school were substitutes. So I go back and we read together in jail every day, and he undergoes this intellectual transformation, and I feel a little closer, a little less culpable. And so this question of what is peace, for me, it's about creating spaces of mental freedom. It's about being a little closer when a lot of us tend, myself included, the people I talk to tend to be people of similar backgrounds, educational backgrounds. So how do we close these spaces, and how do we give up this idea of our own innocence? And these are hard questions that we try to deal with every day. 1 out of 2 African American kids without a high school education will end up tied up to the prison system. And when we embrace the idea that poverty causes crime, like it is poverty, we begin to have an idea of what we need to do, right? We have to end economic inequality.
Right, thank you. And then I had a specific question for you along the lines of that initial question also. As I know, as I said when I introduced you, you went back to Japan to really research your book. Did you have an idea of what the plot and the basic themes of the book were before you left, or did you discover them there? I was very curious about that.
Oh, well, golly. It's really embarrassing because I got the idea for the book when I was 19, and I turn 50 next month, so.
Slow is good.
As the person who wrote 14 novels.
Slow is what I got. But thank you, John. I needed his blessing. Don't we all? Also, I keep getting really distracted because every time I see Christopher surf, I keep thinking, Rubber Ducky, you're the one. And I feel like, forget the panel discussion, let's just sing.
On for that.
Because that would certainly bring peace to my life. So to answer Christopher's question, so I got this idea for the book when I was 19 because a friend of mine who was a university chapel of my college had asked me to attend a lecture. And he asked me because nobody wanted to come. And I'm a very dutiful, compliant person. So I went, and of course there were 2 students at my entire university, me, Wilson, and then the university chaplain, the organizer, and then the speaker. And the speaker was an American missionary. And as you can imagine, 19-year-olds are not thinking that this is a sexy topic. So this American missionary, this very nice white guy from America, decides to go to Japan and serve the poor. The poor Korean Japanese who are despised in this country. So he told us about this very sad history, and of course I'm Korean American, so I think I should be interested in this, and I was interested, but I was kind of like spacing out, as one does when you are 19 and thinking about your bad boyfriend. I have since left him. However, he did tell this really interesting story about a 13-year-old boy in his parish who was Korean Japanese. He was born in Japan, ethnically Korean. His parents were also ethnically Korean, and they're both working class. And one day, this 13-year-old boy who had just graduated from middle school, he climbed up to his apartment building and he jumped off to his death. And his parents were absolutely just devastated, as one would be. And they went through his things and they found his yearbook because he had just graduated. And in his yearbook, his classmates who were Japanese had written, "Go back to where you belong. I hate you. You smell like kimchi," and they wrote the words, "die, die, die." I did not know it then, I was 19, but I became a political writer at that moment because that story changed my life. Everything I write about is political. I care about politics, but I do think that I'm not a political writer in the sense of writing something in nonfiction. I want to create stories in which I want to understand every single person's point of view. I'm very, very distressed right now, as I'm sure all of us are, by the things that have happened in Pittsburgh. I don't think that's what America's all about. We seek peace with the tools that we have.
Wow. hard to follow that up with a point that is as important as that, I think. David, in fact, I'd love to call on you after that, because you wrote a book that is also a very important aspect of what we might be ignoring too much in America.
Yeah, so I was thinking about that peace question. Do you start off thinking, I mean, if I'd started off thinking, I'm going to write a book about peace, how do I go about this? That really wouldn't have worked as a starting point. And it's interesting that most of us are talking about a small idea we had that we then begin to explore as we write the book. And that's certainly what happened to me. I mean, you know, this idea of writing about moral injury, I had no idea what moral injury was really when I started. And it only through the process of trying to explain the soldiers and Marines and sort of combatants that I got to know. I was just slowly trying to figure out what this was, and it was a sort of a dawning recognition of what we ask of people that we send to war on our behalf. And so that became also a burning determination, really, to tell their story. You know, I started off in life as I grew up in a Quaker family and was a conscientious objector, and then through a series of accidents, I became a war correspondent. And so that's what I've done most of my career. And it really came full circle in the course of being a journalist and trying to understand and explain, as I said, the people that we send to war on our behalf. So it did turn out to be a peace book in the sense that I discovered, along with a lot of the 17 and 18 and 19-year-olds that we send to war, that war is I don't want to use the Marine F-bomb word, but it's about the worst thing that we could possibly do. And I found a lot of people in uniform, in combat, who were just like, this is awful. We should never do this again. Even though there are acts of individual generosity and nobility, really, in war, but they're individual acts. And as a whole enterprise, it's something that we ought never to be done. So I didn't start out to write a book about peace building, but it came out that way.
Can I ask you?
Yeah.
Go.
Do you agree with Paul Fussell that all war is a crime?
Nah. You know, so one of my first experiences as a journalist, as a war correspondent, was I went to Mozambique, and I happened on the site of a massacre that had happened. This was when the Rhodesians were fighting black Africans. And the Rhodesian army had come into what was basically a refugee camp. Where they thought there were terrorists hiding, and they killed a lot of people, and they left a lot of people wounded, and then set the woods on fire, so that many, many women and children burned to death. And so I got there a day later, and so I'm a Quaker kid, pretty convinced in the value of nonviolent resistance, and I was like, okay, this would not have worked here. And I wanted somebody to come in and punish the people who'd done that. That was a very un-Quakerly thought. I later, by happenstance, came across an old Rhodesian army video, which was all about the raid that they'd done on this camp of terrorists and extolling the virtues of their soldiers who killed a lot of the enemy and left them to burn to death in the woods. I was horrified. And so that was one of my earliest experiences as a journalist. And out of that came, I think, a maturing of my idea about war and peace. And because then that war went on and on and on and on, and in some sense is still going on.
In Mozambique? Yeah.
In Mozambique and Rhodesia, and that
reported
whole
on
part
that
of
war
southern
myself.
Africa, the war never, I mean, the white regime eventually fled, as we know. Then there came a long period of corruption and oppression, and those animosities and hatreds and resentments and bitterness never really got resolved. So my thinking did mature, and really there's sort of an arc in which I came to, I wanted to explore the whole world of the military and what is that about? So I've written a lot about nuclear deterrence and throw weights and arms control and all that kind of stuff. But eventually came back to where I felt very comfortable with the young combatants that we send out into the world and their whole view of this, which is, this is, if you'll excuse the expression, this is fucked up, basically their view.
Wow. Patricia, before we move on, I'd love to ask you the question we started with, basically, because you've written compelling novels with compelling characters, but they're also about diaspora, and so I'd love to know how you balanced that as you started writing.
Well, I start my work very intimately, and it's an exercise in compassion, and I think starting that way approaches the larger goal of touching on the possibilities of peace in our world. But peace is such a huge word, and I feel like there's so much impacted in that. And one of the things one of the threads, or one of sort of the entry points into a work, is thinking about the wars at home. And I don't just mean, what we see in the newspapers and things like that. What Minjin said got me thinking about what that boy endured in Japan, the things that were written into his yearbook. Just got me thinking about, my own life, as a daughter of immigrants, as a minority in America, the quiet wars at home I endured on a daily basis just from my own community, the way that people treated my parents who were foreigners with accents, the way people treated me, the way people, continue to treat me and sort of second guess my right to the English language, or to even exist in this country and have access to opportunities, and question my citizenship or my family's citizenship. And obviously the time that we're in now, we want to say that this is not our country's values, but at the same time, there's so much structural racism built into even our Constitution, the way Native Americans were even denied the right to citizenship in their own country. And the value of a man was determined by the color of his skin. That's how humanity was defined for a long time in this country. So the effort to write about peace really just begins about the commitment to write the truth. And to really just not turn away, or to turn a blind eye. And once you commit to a story of truth, which really just begins to that primary character, who they are, and writing the truth of their life, then you can sort of begin to approach this idea of peace, which is what we all in our hearts, as humans, as members of this race, what we all hope for.
There's one aspect of the veins of the ocean that relates to Michelle's writing too, that also relates to your larger point now, which is the way we treat incarcerated people and what life is like after incarceration, and why our country has a higher percentage by a mile of incarcerated people than any others. I wondered, and I'd love Michelle to answer this too after you're finished with this question, did you see any hope in your actual experiences, or the ones you wrote about, at least in your novel, in the way that prisoners live, that they could be rehabilitated, or that we're doing anything right at all in that process?
Well, there's not a simple way to answer that question, because one thing that I learned about when I moved to the state of Florida is that the state of Florida has a very particular prison system, and it changes state by state, and even prison by prison, to the way that inmates are treated, and the way that their humanity is determined by what programs are available to them for rehabilitation, or what access they have even to their families after being incarcerated. I'm a very hopeful person. I've also known a lot of incarcerated people and very close to me. So I don't think that the fact that a person commits even the most heinous crimes disqualifies them from being a member of the human race. or even it means that we then, as a people, have the right to execute them. I think that's one of our, American barbarisms. We're one of the few countries in the world, and we like to think that we champion human rights, but we violate this, on a daily basis, some states more than others. So I have seen prison programs that do wonderful things to really give inmates the tools to return to society with skills and really, prepared for the challenges that await them on the outside. And there are prisons who do the exact opposite, where the way that guards treat the inmates is not regulated and all sorts of abuses take place. So, and of course, we see the privatization of the prison system now and how immigrants and detainees are treated and how all of this is really unmonitored and unregulated. So we have a lot of work to do. And if we want to believe at all that we support peace, that's one place where we should really begin.
Michelle, I'd love you to chime in on that too, because you've done a lot of work at San Quentin, I know, where you actually tutored, and you said last night something that really moved me was that they were better students than the students that you've had in other places.
Oh, yeah.
More committed. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, so I had students at San Quentin Prison who would come to class and say, on the 5th reading of this Chekhov short story, I discovered... and I just felt so ashamed because I would be cramming that story right before I got there. And sometimes when I tell that story, people say, well, they have a lot of time to read. But that actually, I would like to correct that misconception. My students would wake up at sometimes 5:30, 6 a.m. They would go to work for less than $1 an hour. Then they would go to maybe a counseling group. And then they would go, they just had so many things packed in a day, more things than I had packed. And then they always made time to do homework. And the wait list for this program, I think it had like 300 students trying to get in from within the prison. And that doesn't include the number of prisoners, or we should say incarcerated people all across California who wanted to get into this prison because it had more resources and more programs and more volunteers because it was in an area near a lot of colleges, right? So there's California State Hayward, Stanford, Berkeley, a lot of colleges with people to volunteer. And the question is, where is the hope? And let me begin with some of the hopeless statistics. The United States incarcerates 25% of the world's incarcerated population, so at a higher rate than the most authoritarian countries. This is a country that solves its problems by sending people to jail. When I was a teacher, when kids got into fights, 15-year-old kids, our school would send them to the jail, and the rationale was, oh, this is where she can learn where she's headed in life. So when we think about how early it begins, how soon we decide to solve problems with punishment rather than by talking to people, by getting them to talk about what's going on in their lives. So it's so basic, but so necessary, and so commonsensical, right? There is a lot to be hopeless about, but when I get hopeless, I think that I don't have an option to be hopeless. Not when my students are hopeful people, students are incredibly hopeful. They want to learn. They want to read. Whether it was in the school during silent reading, and this is like a readerly community, so I love being in readerly communities. During silent reading for kids who had been labeled as noisy or rowdy, you couldn't hear a pin drop when the kids were reading. They were so thirsty for a quiet space, for a space where they could just be themselves, where they could have a whole other world. And that is across the board true, whether you're in a school or in a jail or an impoverished community. And that is where I find that hope, that thirst for a richer inner life that I think every person has.
Great. I can't resist telling a sad story that relates to that a little bit about how deep this problem can be. In our work in the Mississippi Delta, we discovered partly what you've discovered about the power of books. And so we arranged for a donation of kids' books to a school in Indianola, Mississippi that absolutely had almost none. And these books were so treasured by the teachers that ironically they locked them up in a room because they were afraid the kids would steal them or destroy them. So the kids had very limited access to this, so it didn't solve the problem. But that's the kind of problem that shows you how much work we have to do. Anyway, I want to see, first of all, before I move on, if anybody here in our front row panel has anything to add to the conversation so far, or a question of their own. So it looks like Bob's volunteering again, so that's great.
Is there a special food that you eat to make your writing better? And if not, why not? Okay, if you don't like that question, I have another.
That's a great question.
Should art be a battleground for social justice? How's that one? That's better. So morally good versus creatively better. Which do you want to choose?
Who wants to take a crack at that? Anybody?
Can I answer the food one? So I love lemons with salt, and I eat them like they're an apple. I eat the rind and everything. And so my keyboard is always super sticky. But there's something about it that really helps me get where I need to go.
There you go. Any drugs?
Later, Bob, later.
Wow.
Come on, you have to respond to the social justice issue of where art belongs in its positioning around social justice or social issues, social conscience. Does it have a place?
Okay, Bob.
I was looking at
You're gonna humor me.
We get the point. We get the question. I think the wrong word in the question is should.
Yeah.
I don't think that we can, I know we shouldn't impose on the art of fiction the necessity to demonstrate a social conscience or to be political. I think we have to be true to the authenticity of the story and the authenticity of our characters. But in my own case, I can only say, I don't bring in the polemics until I know I have the right characters and the right situation for it. I am careful not to impose my politics, which are constant. I feel them all the time. My own social conscience, I'm aware that I never want to impose it on the characters I'm writing about and what their story is. On the other hand, if their story opens a door to the politics I'm comfortable with, or the polemical opinion I have about this or that issue, I won't hesitate to use it. But as I said before, over the course of now 15 novels, it works out to be about half of my novels end up having that polemical, pick a side, take it, no ambiguity about it component. But I don't, I don't like the imperative that we must, as fiction writers, have or develop a social conscience in our work. That's just another of the many autocratic ways there are to look at writing what we should and shouldn't do. There's enough of that. I wouldn't impose that.
I think it also depends on what the subject is, right? So I think in some cases the decision of whether something is political or not has been made for you. I was born into a world where Palestine is a charged word. I didn't have any part in deciding that. I literally, a couple of weeks ago, had, I guess it was a couple months now, had like a 20-minute conversation with a woman who stopped me in a grocery store and said, "You have an interesting features, where are you from?" And I said, "Palestine," and her face completely changed, and she said, "Well, that's not a place." This was in a Whole Foods in Manhattan. So the first 5 minutes was trying to figure out if she was kidding or just sort of being like contrarian. But no, this woman truly believed that it was not a place that existed, and it was sort of a fake, made-up identity. And so, where is the choice in that? It's not a should or shouldn't. That is what you've inherited. And so, in that case, writing about something like Palestine, of course, it's going to be a place where you're going to have to work with social justice, and it's a place that I'm honored to get to do that work, because I have a voice and not everybody does, and I have access and I have audiences sometimes, and that's not something to take for granted. So, yeah.
Great. Anyone else want to respond to that question?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at it. So I think many of us are driven by a sense of social injustice, right? And in my case, what the injustice was here are these kids that we send into combat. We don't really know what we ask of them and can't really appreciate them, but we need to know, because the big decisions about war and peace are made by all of us, right? The Iraq War, we kind of went along with that writ large, even though a lot of us, Bob included, or maybe Bob especially, were against it. But as a political body, we let that happen and we let it go on, and we're still letting it go on. And I had this very keen sense of, living with these combatants, these young kids, that was unfair, that we were asking them in sort of in silence to do something that we really had no idea about, and we needed to know about that, which is what drove me to write about them. And that was sort of the animating spark of the book that I wrote. But I knew at the time that, I couldn't just write about what is moral injury and why is it important, but I had to tell their stories. And I loved their stories. And so the joy for me was not in pushing this social justice or injustice polemic, but in telling their stories and letting them tell the stories and illustrating this this desire I had to illuminate this problem, letting them tell it and letting them show it. So it's embedded in the art, really. But as you were saying, what a platform. And you got to use it.
Yeah, it's the idea of fairness. The idea of fairness, I can't ever imagine political leadership considering it fair or unfair to send kids to war. Just can't. They don't think that way.
Yeah, but we can.
We can, yeah.
But what seems so important about your book, especially in this regard, is that you say that we're all responsible, and I agree in some way, when we go to war, but these stories are kept really hidden. And people talk about things like boots on the ground. They're not even people anymore. And that's why I think nonfiction in this case, but still telling stories, is so critical, obviously. Yeah. We have a question here from Margaret.
So we talked a little bit about it last night, but I just want to ask about revision and its connection to failure and uncertainty. Because when you have a finished book, it seems like it was all smooth sailing. So I just wanted, anybody who wants to address any part of that.
I'll try. It's
Great.
It's related actually to Bob's question. So it took me 7 years to write, and I set out to write one kind of book that was capital M morally good. It was a polemic, and I wanted to write a manifesto about these things I've talked about. But when I read the pages, they saw like nobody likes somebody preaching at them. Like how, and it wasn't true to who I was as a person. I try to examine myself, to figure out where I went wrong, my own limitations, promises that I haven't kept to people, to myself. There's this amazing James Baldwin quote about how liberals read all the right books and have all the proper attitudes, but when the chips are down and you expect them to deliver, they're somehow not there. And I thought, like, what? I know there have been places I haven't been that I haven't shown up to. And so in this process of revision, I tried to just talk about how I haven't been there and where I have been, and to keep it close to that. And so the voice changed a lot. The other thing is, as we think about what drives us to write, especially in our climate now, we tend to classify people as victims or victimizers. It's one or the other. But when we're thinking about what's actually true, the truth is that most of us are both victimizer and victim in our lives, right? We're both people who let things slide, and we're also people who have been victimized. So in the revision process, getting across that truth was really important to me. No.
Anyone else want to talk about that? Min?
So when I wrote an entire manuscript called Motherland between 1996 to 2003, which was the first iteration of Pachinko, it was really dreadful. So I didn't send it out because I had had so many rejections, I just couldn't take another one. And I put it aside, and then later on I wrote another book, and then my husband got this job in Japan, and then I moved. And then I started to interview the Korean Japanese people, and I had long conversations with dozens and dozens of them. And one of the things that I learned about being a member of a despised minority is that they don't really see themselves as some hated people. They just don't. And I would get really upset, being a fragile person that I am, which you have witnessed now. I know. Poor man. I would get really upset, and they would say to me, "Why are you getting so upset? This is my life." And they had such integrity about the way they lived. And they had so many workarounds because they knew that the world was corrupt. And that gave me hope. It gave me so much hope to persist, because I realized that if you could deal with institutional racism, legal racism, social hatred, even as children, I realized that I had to keep persisting in the work that I do. So I threw that book away and I started all over again. So that I think that you have this macro issue of inequity. And I think that social justice is something that all of us in this room are deeply concerned with. But I also think that what we really hunger for is a moral order. To believe that there is an eternal moral order. And I think a lot about the epigraph of Anna Karenina, where he actually quotes the Bible. And it's from Deuteronomy, and it's, "Vengeance shall be mine, saith the Lord." And I wondered often what Tolstoy was thinking when he wrote that, to put that as the epigraph of his book, because he cared deeply about a moral order, and he wasn't a conventional Christian. He was actually kind of a nutty Christian. But this whole idea that, is there vengeance? And whose is it? And I think that if we have this moral order and the sense that there's somebody who's really going to take care of it in the end, perhaps then we can persist.
I'll just add one thing about, revision, like the nuts and bolts. I teach, so I teach revision and strategies and how to go from draft to draft. But I think speaking about peace and compassion and things, that as writers you have to sort of be compassionate to yourself and to your drafts, and understand that that what you've written is also part of the effort in order to move the language, move it forward, move the structure of it or the themes, or get closer to your designs and your goals for it, and your larger goals towards social justice or moral order, whatever it may be. But you have to kind of forgive yourself and forgive your errors and forgive your ambitions and all those things in order to just let it be. And we were talking about this last night, and kind of divorce yourself from words on the page and understand that the words are actually here, right? So that you don't become so sentimentally chained to a draft that you don't allow it to have another incarnation into something better. Because no matter what you write next, it's going to be better. So.
I haven't had
John, you look like you're ready to pass on this, or am I just guessing?
You think I'm ready to pass on this?
No. Well, slowly bounce around.
I didn't know I was so good at deceiving you.
Well, congratulations.
Revision is what most people think of as repetition. But if you're a writer, you have to love it. You have to love the repetition. I had a life as a wrestler before I began writing, while I was writing, and over time, actually just for too long, into my 30s. I competed as a wrestler for 20 years, badly. I never won a tournament at any level of the sport, high school, college, post-college. I was in some very good wrestling rooms, Pittsburgh, Iowa, the New York Athletic Club. I had some very good teammates. I had some very good sparring partners. But I wasn't as good as they were. And I had the good fortune of having a coach who told me when I was 15, 16 years old that, in his estimation, I would never be very good. I wasn't a good enough athlete to be very good. But he said, you can still do pretty well. You can beat people who are better than you if you do this, if you do that. And what he implied, which I was too young to understand, was that if you love something, you love doing it. What Hala said yesterday about the process of writing, if you don't love that, you might as well stop. Because the process is the part you have to love. There's an exercise which I'm looking at Mark in the back row, which every former wrestler in the room understands. It's called drilling. With a willing sparring partner, you make all your best moves on him. He lets you do it, and then he does his on you. Outside single leg, double leg, high crotch, duck under, arm drag, over and over and over again, until something that is not second nature becomes second nature. Well, I learned to love the revising before I was a writer, because I realized that if you didn't love that part of a process, if you only cared about how successful the outcome was, then you might as well work for money. Because what's your motivation if it isn't interior, right? So revision is just a fact of loving what you do. And I've had students who have said to me, I'm really into the writing, the rewriting, not so much. I've said, do something else. Those are the only students I was not sympathetic to. People who wouldn't revise. I just looked them in the eye and said, then you should be doing something else. You don't get this the first time. It doesn't happen that way.
A question related to revision that I'd love to ask you, John, too, and also Gilbert, if you want to answer it. This one comes from the audience as well, about the challenges of a different kind of revision, taking something you wrote as a book and then changing it to a screenplay or revising it so it could work that way. You've been doing that with Cider House Rules, of course, and Gilbert, I know your book is also ready to be a miniseries, I think. So can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, but I don't know anything about screenwriting. I'm a consultant, and I look at the history and make sure they get things right. As far as, I went to a meeting once, a Hollywood kind of meeting, and they're saying, that's a great beat, this is a beat. I didn't even know what a beat was. And I'm the last person to ask about that, but I do know about storytelling, and so I can consult on that. But I think John's probably a better person to ask about screenplays, because he's actually done them.
You willing to do it again, sir?
It wouldn't be my career choice. It's not my day job, so to speak. I was lucky to learn how to do it. I didn't believe I was lucky at the time. I worked with a very old school director adapting a screenplay from my first novel, a historical novel, Setting Free the Bears, about the Anschluss in Vienna and the occupation of Vienna post-war. Most of it takes place in the Soviet district of occupation. It is a novel that if an American writer wrote it today, it would not be published. As simple as that. I was lucky to have it published at the time. A historical novel about Austria written by an American, nobody would touch it. Not now. I worked for 2 years on that screenplay for Columbia Pictures in the UK, Columbia Pictures London, not Columbia Pictures Hollywood. And the film was never made. I was very bitter. I wanted nothing to do with the process again. And the director said to me, don't worry, kid, you learned something. And one day I did want to adapt my own novel again. I declined to write the screenplay for George Hill for The World According to Garp. He didn't see it the way I saw it. I declined to write the screenplay for The Hotel New Hampshire. Tony Richardson asked me. I knew Tony wanted to do it himself. He was just being courteous. So I backed out. But I saw how to do Cider House even as I was finishing the novel. It took 4 directors and 13 years. I wouldn't mind spending 13 years writing my own novel, but to spend 13 years waiting for people to make a screenplay that's already written is a pain in the ass. Which is why it's not my day job. I'm always doing something else. When someone asks me to write a screenplay, if I have time, I'll do it. And then it's a wait and see process. But the issue in Cider House was very simple. It takes place over 15 years. I thought the movie should happen over a period of between 15 or 18 months. I didn't want anyone to grow older so that they had to be replaced by different actors. So I had to 15 years into 18 months so that I could make it happen in that period of time. A lot of the story, a lot of the characters are therefore lost. But I had to find something that could be gained. And in the process of adaptation, you know if you're adapting a novel to a feature-length film, much will be lost. Miniseries are a better formula for novelists. I've been working on a miniseries lately. It's a lot easier. 5 episodes, 275 minutes. It's not only a longer film, but it comes in chapter-esque parts. Very suitable for novelists. I don't care how good a screenplay for a feature-length film is, it's always too long. There's a sag in the middle. I was pleased with Cider House, but I still felt it had a sag in the middle. But you have to find something. If you're throwing a lot of things away, you have to find something that will work better in the screenplay than it did in the novel. And I got to that better part in Cider House's case for this reason. When the kid who leaves the orphanage because he doesn't want to perform abortion, he doesn't want to be the doctor he's been trained to be. The only thing his mother did for him was let him live. He has a good reason not to want to perform that procedure. And the old doctor says to him, if women don't have a choice, why should you? He will never get away from that question. In the novel, it takes him 15 years to recognize that he can't get away from that question. You know how to do it? They need it. Do it. Well, that's a moral conundrum, right? So, in the movie, it means less if he's only away for 18 months, doesn't it? However, here's the advantage. If the young doctor who doesn't want to be an abortionist goes back to the orphanage after only 18 months, guess who's still there? All the orphans he grew up with who were never adopted. I couldn't make that happen in the book. But in the screenplay, they were there. And they are the example of why it's a good thing that he's performing that procedure, because nobody's taken them, and nobody will. Right? When I hear the right to life people say, as I've heard them say, oh, if only there were orphanages again and people could adopt. I know what a historical lie that is. It didn't happen. Okay? So that was the compelling reason to want to make that film, because I could do something that I couldn't make happen in the novel. When Homer Wells goes back to St. Cloud's in the novel, the orphans he knew are either dead or they've moved on, right? Different.
It's fascinating. Thank you. Are any of you having your books adopted or working on such a thing? And if so, I'd love to hear. Min, have you got anything to add to that?
So when my first book came out in 2007, Free for Millionaires, I had a really famous person want to option it, and he went to Hollywood, and they all said to him, Asians need not apply. And he had the doors kind of like slammed into his face. It was like a very, very famous prize-winning writer. And I was like, okay, well, that's that. And then what ends up happening, and I don't know if any of you guys are guilty of this, and let me apprise you that we are all really vulnerable to this question, which is your stuff being made into a movie? And all of us always feel ashamed when people say no, because it's really embarrassing. So then when Pachinko came out, I figured for sure that would never, ever get made, because it's a book written in English, the first book of its kind about the Korean Japanese in the world. for a novel for adults. And I figured nobody would want to read that book. No, who would want to watch it? And then there was a bidding war. So there was this crazy bidding war for it, and it was recently picked up by Apple TV, which doesn't even have a network. But they want to be the network, and they outbid. I haven't seen money for this, by the way, so. But it sounds exciting. The money, that is. I'd like to have some. Anyway, so you have Apple TV outbidding, like, what is it, Hulu and HBO and Netflix. You've heard of them. And they've hired a really fancy showrunner who is so smart and talented, and she's Korean American, and I just trust her implicitly. I would never tell her what to do. So I feel really lucky. I think that if it gets ordered, so it's been optioned, and most likely it will get ordered, but if it gets ordered to production with passing the pilot stage, because apparently it was quite a sexy deal, so I've heard, it will be a 4-season show, like 50 episodes, something like that. So that'll be interesting. But if it doesn't happen, we'll still be friends, right?
Then are you going to be writing some of it, or?
You know, I'm an executive producer, which is hilarious. So apparently I get meaningful consultation. Is that what you have,
Yeah.
Gilbert? Yeah, right? Yeah, which means that you don't have the right to say no. But you can be
And they have a right to do it anyway. after you
right,
say
but
that.
I'm gonna be meaningful. It's in my contract. And I get my own card, which I learned is like a term. That means that, like, that's a card, I guess.
Yeah.
And it's gonna say executive producer Min Jin Lee, and I'll have my moment. And I pray to God that my parents are alive to see it.
Great, thank you. Anyone else on the subject of screenplay? Okay, well then I have a question for you, Hala, which is something I asked you a moment before, which is if, as unlikely as it might seem now, a new Palestine was finally formed in a way that the Palestinians were somewhat comfortable with, if that were to happen, would that alleviate any of the pain or the issues that your characters have in your book, or that you yourself might feel? Just curious about that.
I mean, I told you earlier, I was like, I don't think I'm gonna have a good answer for it. And I don't have a good answer for it. I think, I mean, yes, in a word, I would imagine so. I think that the right to return is such a core issue of the Palestinian cause. And so what I imagine when you say a new Palestine is some sort of access to a place that for many people, for many generations, there hasn't been access to. So the one thing I am wary about of like speculating what that new Palestine would look like is that I recognize I don't want to veer too much into the territory of diasporic tourism. I am not somebody that was born and raised in Palestine. I am somebody with an American passport. I'm somebody with innumerable privileges. And I'm always wary of those of us with these sort of privileges kind of pontificating and deciding for the people that are actually on the ground in the country what the appropriate future looks like, or what an appropriate vision for Palestine looks like. I think that's something that needs to be determined by Palestinians in Palestine. Now, how it might connect to me personally as a member of the diaspora, I think access would be wonderful. I think that, for those of us belonging to this community, more often than not, we are developing identities and understandings of ourselves and our ancestors in absentia. It's an identity formed in the absence of something, not in the presence of it. And so I can only imagine that having access to land, to the places that our grandfathers and grandmothers and great-grandfathers and great-grandmothers lived would be bittersweet in many ways, but I'm sure it would be transformative. The one thing is that a lot of those places don't exist anymore. And so, I think it would become a question of what would that new space look like? Yeah.
Yeah, one more. Okay, well, I have a question from Stephen Otto from the audience, and that might be a good question to close with, which is a lot of you have been writing about very difficult things, very painful things, and he's curious how that affects your writing. Do you find it harder to write at those times because you yourself become emotional or depressed, or does that actually help your writing? I imagine it might be some of both, but I'd love to hear what some of you have to say about that. Anybody?
All right, well, I'll take a crack at this because I have spent most of my life in kind of emotionally difficult and scary situations. So we were talking about this last night. I'm kind of embarrassed that it never, even though I've written about moral injury and PTSD and people who've been badly wounded, it never really affected me, I don't think, unless somewhere deep down, because I always saw things that were happening through the lens of a storyteller. So while bad things are going on, I'm there, but I'm thinking, how do I capture this? How do I convey this? Who are the characters? What does this smell like? And what does it sound like? And I'm so busy doing that that in a sense I'm kind of removed from what's actually going on, and I don't have to grapple with, somebody's trying to kill me. And so it's a little uncomfortable in the sense that I don't come back feeling damaged or feeling bruised. I come back feeling energized because I've got these great stories to tell. Like I say, that's a little bit embarrassing, and I'm not really happy to be talking about it, but the fact is, somebody asked me recently, aren't you scared being out there? And when I first started off in this, I spent 4 years in Africa, and I was terrified the whole time. I was just like totally terrified. And I guess it kind of got out of my system. And then, like I say, I began to see these experiences as story material. And that does it did kind of insulate me. So thanks for the question.
Great. Anyone else want to comment on that?
I'll say a few words. In the case of The Veins of the Ocean, that was a book that was very, very close to me. And so the research really affected me personally, not just because it was dealing about exile and immigration and diaspora and incarceration and the death penalty and murder, sexual assault, inherited trauma, and transnational identities, well, everything basically, and some things that are very, very close to me. So it was very hard, very hard. And last night Minju brought up Aristotelian poetics and the idea of reading for catharsis, but also I think in writing it was also there was an effort there, maybe I wasn't even aware of at the time, to find a catharsis of my own in the writing of the story. And there were moments when I was crying writing, stuff like that. But then when it was finished and the revision was finished and all those things, it took a lot out of me personally. The research, I threw myself so much into it that it changed my life. The people, I'm a real person, so the people I meet really affect me. I was a very different person by the time I finished writing that book to who I was before. And it's not that I had to let go of it, but I had to sort of understand my life is different now as a result of what I put into it, what the book gave me. So it's, I guess that it took me a long time to begin a new project after that too, for those reasons. And then I was troubled by that, and I didn't think I would write another book because I was almost too sensitive to go on. But of course you do go on in time. But as a writer, I've kind of learned to embrace that each book will take me to the next book, who I need to be for the next book, and that book will challenge me and change me and depress me and scare me and you know, do all sorts of things that it needs to do in order for me to be able to write it and hopefully get close to creating some sort of an experience for the reader.
Great. Oh, I'm glad you talk about the growth process of writing. Maybe that leaves some hope that people who read the books would grow some as well. But I'd love to ask one thing quickly, Sharon, because it does seem like a good closing, is with all the terrible things that have happened and that some of you are writing about, are you hopeful at all that some of these things will be corrected? Does anybody, hopefully somebody will think so we can close on.
You know, I'd love to speak on this because I think people have been really down on America. And when I lived in Japan, I used to go to this church called Tokyo Union Church. And I went because I wanted to meet other people who spoke English. I was so tired of not speaking Japanese and feeling stupid. So I would go to church. There's logic in there somewhere. And then once a month, there had this thing called the curry service. Curry being this kind of Japanese curry. It's like a gravy with a little bit of meat, and you have this huge bowl of rice in front of it. And it was for the homeless people in Japan. And the homeless people in Japan are among the cleanest homeless people you'll find in the world because they have public baths in Japan. For not very much money, you could take a bath. So they come and they line up for 4 to 5 hours for this plate of rice and curry. And my family and I would serve there once a month because we wanted to meet people. It wasn't because we were so nice. And they would line up and they would come in and they would wear these American polo shirts. And they would have things like Whistling Creek Country Club. Really, like Winged Foot Country Club, and they would have, it would be like Lacoste, and like, this is really interesting. They're so clean and they have nice shirts, but they're Japanese, and you know they live in Yogi Park in tents, and they're very polite. And it turned out it's because all the people who had given them clothes were Americans, and all the people who served in this kitchen were Americans, and even though we can be deplorable, all of us, I also know that this idea of voluntarism and charity is a very uniquely American concept. The idea that we think that it's important once in a while to show up for the poor, maybe not every day, like the way Michelle can, but once in a while, and that is something really beautiful. And I felt very proud to be an American when I was there, so. I felt hope.
Well, thank you, man. I think that is a wonderful note to close on. And so I want to thank, first of all of you guys for what I think was a great discussion.